All right, we're going to start. There's been a search all morning for the water, and it was just behind the door there. How's everyone doing? That's all right. That's pretty good, actually. Go on, let's try it again. How's everyone doing? So, this is the podcast summit. Does everyone know that they're here for the podcast? Yeah, quite. Yeah, people just jumping up. There was a little bit of confusion with the rooms, I think, but this is definitely the podcast summit. Who have we got in the room? We've got any public service broadcasters? Mostly public service broadcasters, okay. Have we got any commercial broadcasters? A handful of commercial broadcasters and some independent production houses as well. A couple of those, okay. Mostly public service, interesting. Have we got, have people got one podcast? Who runs one podcast? Who runs 5 podcasts? Who runs 10? 20? Okay, all right, bit of a mixed bag. Welcome to the podcast summit. My name is Sam Bonham. I work at the BBC. I run news podcasts at the BBC, including the daily news podcast. And myself, along with Remi, who's here at the front, and Nessa, who you might know, have helped put together today's podcast summit. And we've got loads and loads of really great speakers. We're going to split things up into 3 for today. So first up, we've got kind of 3 keynote speakers. Talking about data, talking about the market, talking about kind of where we're at, challenges and solutions. Then we're going to get some case studies. Remi's going to host a session with 3 kind of specific case studies of people doing successful things in podcasting. And then we've got an expert panel, which James Cridland is going to moderate, where people can ask questions. And actually, you guys can ask questions throughout. We will have moments where we'll kind of say, has anyone got any questions? But frankly, if people want to contribute something, I say just chuck your hand up and kind of we'll get a microphone to you, because I think this should be as kind of informal and as kind of engaging and dynamic as we can possibly make it. If you want to ask a question but you don't want to put your hand up, just send me a message on Swapcard and I will ask it for you. My name's Sam Bonham and you'll find me on Swapcard. There are 3. As I say, 3 sections. We've got 2 15-minute breaks. We're going to be really strict on timings because actually, as you'll know, there's actually 4 summits going on today, and all of the summits have got exactly the same break time, so everyone's kind of networking together. So we're going to be really strict on our timings. And actually, you are allowed to move between summits. So if you want to stick in this one for a bit and then try out youth or try out AI or whatever, that's absolutely fine. And I'm expecting people to kind of come in, grab a seat, don't worry. People to come in and out of the sessions. We will be finished pretty much on the dot, I think, at 4 o'clock. And then after 4 o'clock, there's then a networking session. Then there's this Nickelback film, which I think starts at 5:15 or 5:30, which is in town somewhere. And then there is the kind of opening night thing at 7 o'clock, which is also in town. It is also St. Patrick's Day, so I wouldn't be surprised if things go on fairly late. And all of that information is all online. And if you've not downloaded the Swapcard app, if you're new to Radiodays and haven't done a Radiodays before, I'd recommend download the Swapcard app, and it is all there, and actually all pretty simple to use once you get your head around it. Does that all kind of make sense? Does anyone have any questions to start with? Any logistics? No. Okay, great. Okay, cool. So let's do this. Let's get into our keynote speakers. We've got 3 keynote speakers, as I say, talking about challenges in the podcast market. We're going to take a bird's eye view, look at some of the data, and then we're going to talk about marketing and what's going on with promotions around podcasting. Big thanks to our first 3 speakers: Arielle Nissenblatt from the US, working at Descript, Matthieu Rawolle in Switzerland, working at the EBU, and our first speaker today is Maria Lorenz from Pool Artists in Germany. Round of applause, please.
Hi, everyone. It's very nice to see you all here. at this first session. I want to do something. First of all, you're probably going to know that if you listen to podcasts, I'm probably going to speak at the 1.5 speed so that I will get through it, and and don't delay the people after me. So I'm going to say sorry for that already. If you don't understand anything because English is not my native language, then come speak to me afterwards or something like that. I probably know what I said. What I want to do today is talk about podcast state of mind. So what I'm going to do today is not very data-driven or very numbers-driven, but more emotionally driven, because I want to start your day off feeling optimistic about podcasts, because I think not a lot of people are feeling optimistic about podcasts right now. So I want to help you do that and then enjoy the day and make thousands of podcasts after that. So that is my goal to reach. So what we're going to do first is I will tell you who I am so that you like, who is this person? What is she telling me? And then we will talk about the bad, and then the good, and then the uglyish, which basically means we will talk about how everyone is feeling right now. Then the good is how it actually is, and the uglyish that we have to work. I'm going to say sorry already for that. So this is going to happen. And you can see on every slide, you're going to see my contact information if you have any questions or want to be in contact with me or didn't understand a word that I said, I can send you this presentation too. The first thing we're going to talk about is who is Pool Artist? Pool Artist is my company. We produce podcasts since 2015. We produce more than 80, now it's more than 90 actually podcasts. We're producing 44 podcasts right now in different stages of development. And we are a company that is really a huge podcast brand. We do consulting, but mostly creating and producing, but also some writing. We did big podcasts that were just fictional. We do a lot of talking podcasts and so on and so forth. So we've been doing it for almost 10 years. So I'm actually called a veteran in this thing, and it's 8 years. So this is also something that I'm going to talk about later. But let's get started with the bad. Right now, it does feel a little shaky being in the podcast industry. That's what I hear from my colleagues in Germany, but also from some colleagues in other countries. And everyone is like asking questions like, was it a bubble all along? Is the hype over? Are we past the peak? Should we leave the ship? I see some people leaving ship, and why does it feel like this? Why does it feel like this? So this is something that I want to try to figure out today, and also that some of the feelings are wrong, some of them aren't. First of all, of course, it does feel like this because of headlines like this, you know? And some people are writing articles about it that we actually trust. So we read these headlines from people we trust, and we think, uh-oh, did I make a wrong decision to get into the podcast business? Spoiler alarm, you did not. I will prove that later. And you also always have to think about headlines like this work more effectively than podcasts are okay, or it's a usual podcast Wednesday or something like that. So of course you read more headlines like this, and these headlines keep infecting each other, you know? 3 people start, and then 10 people, and then 20, and at some point you're like, it's all I'm reading, so it might be true. And then some of it is true, but not all of it is true. I think what is true, of course, are some very sad truths, that people were being laid off, and big shows are being canceled, and some companies even closing their doors, some production companies, which is very sad. And also, you maybe have the feeling that like big platforms or your clients or whatever you're working with are changing like strategies every half an hour. So that feels a bit desperate. So the whole feeling is kind of like, it doesn't feel good. And then on top of that, there are some very, let me say, big and loud players in the industry that maybe put some money somewhere and it didn't get it back. And so now they're like, instead of saying, oh, I think we made a mistake, they're saying, podcasts are dead, you know? And for me, it's like, I can understand that, it's human. For me, it's the same like when I play a video game and I'm bad at it and I blame the controller, you know, because it's human. And so, but it makes people nervous if big players say stuff like that. And when people get nervous, brands get nervous, and money gets nervous. And since we are the youngest media right now, they kind of get shy and the money goes somewhere else. And that is a problem. And that is something that is really a very sad truth. And also, there is an economical crisis right now. And from within the podcast industry, it feels like a podcast crisis, but everyone is doing badly. 2023 was bad for everyone, you know, almost everyone. And it will be difficult, but it's not only podcasts. So it can feel that way. It feels for me that way sometimes too. So, but once you look past these headlines, there's a lot of good. And for example, we have really like a lot of people and a lot of love, and there are a lot of really, really great numbers surrounding podcasts, some of which I will show you. And once the whole nervousness evaporates a bit, I think we will come out better at the end. Before I show you some numbers, I just want to say that because I know there are some people here who have great numbers and who are good at analyzing them and who are like much smarter than me with numbers, but I'm still going to show you some of them. I saw different statistics, but I rather want to show you a trend, and the trend was the same everywhere. The first one is actually one that surprised me, because these are numbers for the money that is in the podcast market. And these numbers are going up. And they also went up in 2023, last year, where everyone was telling me that there was a lot less money in the market last year than the year before that. But that is just not true. And I also looked at numbers from different countries in Europe, and the trend was always the same. And I found it very interesting because it surprised me, because it felt differently. And probably much smarter people than me in numbers will explain you, hopefully over the day, why. But I have a theory, or I have like 3 small, very shallow theories that I want to share with you. One is that we all kind of came up in podcasting with host ads, and these are getting way less, and programmatic ads getting way more, and it does feel a bit like there's less money getting to the podcasters. And also we have to split all the money between much more podcasts, because there are more podcasts coming up. And also the money goes to the biggest podcasts right now, because it is nervous and shy right now, so it goes to the big and safe ones. And in Germany we have a saying that is, der Teufel scheißt immer auf den größten Haufen. In English, it is literally, the devil always shits on the biggest pile. I think you have a saying, the English people have a saying that goes, them that has gets. That's what I found. And this is something that we really see, because the biggest podcasts, they are doing well. Everything's fine for them. And so a lot of money goes to them. And the platforms are even more shy right now, so to make something new. So that is... and you can say, yeah, but it doesn't matter to me if there's a lot of money in the market if it doesn't get to my podcast. Then I can't continue doing my podcast. And that is right for right now. But still, I think it is good that there is a lot of money in the market, and it's getting more, because at some point, when the dust settles, it will get back down to all the smaller ones again. So that is it is a way better message than the money is actually getting less, like we felt. So, and the next one, this is my favorite slide. So if you take one thing away from today, from what I'm saying, is that there's this one number that is most important, I think. And I know it's a bit emotional, but it is the most important number there is. And this number is very healthy and thriving and growing, and it's the listeners. Because if they are gone, we can all go packing with podcasting. And the listeners are still there, and they're one podcast, and we can be very proud of that this number is growing, because we made these people take away precious time from other media or other stuff they do and give it to us, give it to podcasting. And no matter what happens in the world, no matter the crisis, the people keep on coming in millions. And so even if last year and this year was and will be very hard, I think the money and the brands and the business and the money will always go where there are a lot of people. And we have attentive people, we have smart people, we have emotionally involved people, so the money will gather around them again. I'm very, very sure of that. And so be patient if you can, and podcasts will be great again. And to emphasize why I think that podcasts will keep on growing, we asked some people what podcasts mean to them. We asked German people and then had to, because I forgot that I have to do it in English. We first asked German people in German and then we had to translate it. So I hope you can understand it, but I wrote it all down.
It's not as boring as other media.
It just fits into my life.
I learned a lot about my favorite celebrities.
It's a reliable news source.
It helped me through heartbreak.
I feel like listening to friends.
It's great entertainment.
I get my news whenever I need.
It's fun and it's free.
It feels way more diverse than other media.
I just love deep dives.
It got me interested in new things.
I laughed out loud on the train.
I feel like everyone can do it. Maybe even I.
I learned so many new things.
I can hide from the rest of the world under my headphones.
So yeah, these are the things that most of the answers we got. And I think it all comes down in the core to this. This is what people get from podcasts, and this is what people will still get from podcasts, and this is why people are coming back and why it's growing. And very important, especially today, I'm not saying podcasts invented entertainment and all these kind of things, but I really think that we kind of made it maybe more intimate and more and closer and friendlier and somehow more fitting and also more patient for the people. And for example, if you listen to the one person who said it made me laugh out loud on the train, then we have convenience and we have escapism. And the one person who said, I feel like I could do it, it's empowerment, and it's also friends and knowledge. So I think podcast is a very powerful thing, and this is why I think people will never get tired of it or return to the other media. And that is just something that's not going to happen. So this is also very, very good news. Now we're already at the last part, the ugly-ish. I call it that way. I think of the ugly duckling, you know, we have to work and then get through the times, and then in the end it's going to be beautiful. But we have some work and responsibilities, and the large trees in the background, they represent the other media that are already there and already there longer, so like TV and radio and the internet, and they are super important, and we learn a lot from them and still do. But we are still very small, and people I see or I feel some eye rolling when I say it's a very young industry, but it really, really is. I mean, think about all the things that makes an industry: full-time jobs, big stars, big brands, and all these things. None of them are older than 10 years. And so we really are still very, very young, although some days it might feel a bit longer. And so I think we're going to grow into one of these large trees at one point. But before we do that, we have to do some work. So what does it mean for us? It means we are the first generation in this new medium. And that is a really, really once-in-a-century opportunity, I think. So other medias have mostly fixed rules, and if they change very slowly, and fair enough, they're huge and old, not in a bad way, like wise. And so, but we still get to make the rules. So I'm always saying, don't be lazy, don't just adapt other media's rules, don't just be like, they said we've always been doing it that way. You can just say, yeah, but we are only like 8 years old, so I will just come up with something new. And I know, by the way, podcast exists longer than 8 years. I'm just saying the industry is about 8 years old. And so, yeah, we should not just adapting rules. We should just really make up our own rules and fight for it. Because I know it's very easy to be like, radio feels kind of like a cousin, so just like do it like they do, or the internet. But I think all the things that I just, the people said that it's important to them, we should really protect them and be our own unique medium. So we should really, how do we go to this crisis? And I think the answer is we should really ask ourselves, who do we want to be? And then be active and become that, and not only sit there and read the horrible headlines and just be, I don't know, react instead of act. So I really think I can't stress that enough. We are the first generation of a completely new medium, so we can really, really do something with it, and future generations will follow the rules that we come up with. So let's make it like we want it to be. But how should we do it? Do you all remember why you fell in love with podcasting, with making podcasts, with creating podcasts? Because we have the perspectives of the people who listen to podcasts, but there's this other perspective of people who make the podcast, which is also very, very important, I think, because we all left something to work in podcasts or to make podcasts, because no one yet really grew up in the podcast industry, because that's not possible. So why did we do it? And I think the amazing thing about podcasts is the freedom that we have, freedom of length and hierarchy, diversity and speech, all these things that come with it, with less hierarchy. And also we have so much more of everything, like more time, more intimacy, sometimes more honesty, and it also can be cheap and fast, and then, you know, fuck the rules and just do it. It is possible in podcasts still, and it also sometimes really still works in podcasts. And it's more difficult in other media, which has its good and bad sides, because they also have their thing going. So people who made their own podcast, do you remember the first episode when you loaded it up? I felt like, are we even allowed to do that? Is that even legal? Because, you know, there was no, I just did it, and it was in the internet, and I was like, I'm even getting goosebumps right now, by the way, because I was just like calling my friend, I think it's live, everyone can hear it. Like, everyone? Yeah, it's in the internet. I was like, oh God, I hope audio police doesn't come knocking. I don't know. It just felt so illegal, but it also felt like freedom, because all my friends, all the people that usually don't get a voice or have to go through loops and loops and loops and loops of people, or know someone, or vitamin B or whatever, could just put it out there. And it's still, no, I think put out there means something else. And it still is that medium. I mean, it has become more difficult, but it still is that medium. And these reasons are really the reasons I think that we will come out stronger, because people do love that, and people will still come in millions and listen to it. But yeah, we will keep on working hard and really nurture this uniqueness, and not try to be other media, really. Think about what makes it special, and then just go into that, because the other media we already have. So people come to us to listen to podcasts because it is different. And so we should still try to make greater podcasts and better podcasts, and because if we don't take it seriously, no one will. For me, the best example, I'm sorry, I have to say that, is the Michelle Obama podcast. One of the most, probably smartest women who did so many things and is probably interested in so many things, sat down with her husband, who was the president of the United States, and it was the most boring conversation I've ever heard. It's just, I don't get that, why you don't sit down, and this is what I mean. If we don't take podcasts seriously as the makers of podcasts, then no one will take it seriously. And I think at that point, someone did not take it seriously. It's you know that phrase, give her a microphone, everything else will happen. No, did not. And so, yeah, I'm gonna finish with a thought I want to plant in your head. Yeah, I know. I'm also sorry. I think really now might be the best time to start in podcasting, because unfortunately a lot of very great people are free right now to hire. And there will be a bit more pressure on the whole industry, which usually brings out better rules, more creativity, and makes us all stronger. We all get a bit humbled. I don't think that's a bad thing, to be honest. And also a lot of the dumb money and the dumb people are gone. So it's just us left, the beautiful and smart people, who really love the medium and know what to do with it instead of what I just said. So. Yeah, we still have to remember the bad consequences, but I decided to be optimistic today because you probably will hear some other things today. But really, podcasts are all right, we are all right, and it's very, very great. So, and all the things will be back. The money will be back. The brands, the businesses, whatever is important to you will be back, because we have the right and healthy numbers. We have the lovely target groups. We have the attentive ears and the emotions and the story, and the rest will follow, I'm sure, once the nervousness evaporates. So, and with that, thank you very much for being here and listening to me. Thank you, thank you. Can I take one of these?
Yeah, take a bottle of water. That was amazing. So I'm going to be the little kind of dynamic ad insertion throughout these little things. And that was great. Are you optimistic at the moment, or are you pessimistic, Meera? I'm very optimistic. You're optimistic. Can I just get a sense in the room? Are people optimistic about podcasting? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay, good. Right, great. Good. Cool. Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Meera. So our next speaker is from the EBU, Matthieu Rawolle, who's going to walk us through. It's like the annual Radiodays, like data dump session. So let's get a bit of a sense of where we're at.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Yes, I think so. It's lovely to see you all. Thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm Matthieu, I work in the market research part of the EBU, the organization funded by public service media, mainly in Europe. I work in the market research, and my job is basically to publish reports. And one of my latest publication was the podcast report, published in December. And based on this publication, I wanted to share some trends regarding podcasts, and especially podcast listeners, and trying to understand two main questions. Why do they listen to podcasts, and how do they choose the podcast they listen and they like? So the sources of the data are coming from various public reports, and I try to cover also several European countries. But let's start with, before digging into the core topics, just some numbers about podcast consumption. How popular are podcasts in the EU, actually? Here we have the frequent and regular users of podcasts in the EU. The sources are from Eurobarometer. The regular users are in light blue. So these are the podcast listeners who are listening to a podcast at least once a week. And then we have the frequent users in dark blue. What we can see is that already more than a quarter of EU citizens are at least regular users of podcasts. And we can also see that it's growing. As Maria said it, it's a growing market. And more people are listening to podcasts, because it was at 22% in 2022. And it gained 4 points of percentage to reach 26% in 2023. And also the heavy users, the people who are listening to podcasts every day or almost every day, they were 6% in 2022, and they were 8% in 2023. Now, we also wanted to compare the figures from podcasts with radio, we can see that radio reaches massively. More than 2/3 of EU citizens were regular users of the radio, the live radio. We can still see a slight decline among these regular users. It lost around 5 percentage points in 10 years. And the frequent users were around half of the EU citizens in 2013. And in 2023, they were around 4 in 10. Now moving to the same scope, but just among youth. How popular are podcasts in the EU among the EU citizens aged 15 to 24? What we can see is that podcasts has become commonplace for young people in Europe. The share of regular users of podcasts has reached 44%. We can see also an increase from 2022 to 2023. And the heavy users are also quite important, with 14% of people who are listening to podcasts every day or almost every day, which is also an increase in compared to 2022. Again, a comparison with radio, we saw that some declining trends among the total population. It's more marked among youth. It was more than 2/3 of young Europeans tuning in to radio in 2013, so a weekly reach of around 68%. And it declined. It lost 22 percentage points to reach 46% in 2023. And the decline is also more important among the daily users, or almost daily users of radio listening, because it went from 39% in 2013, to 21% in 2023. So these were some overall figures about consumption of podcasts, but here we are digging into the core topics. Why do people actually listen to podcasts? Why do so many people like this medium? What are the main reasons to listen to podcasts? Here we have the percentage of people who consume podcasts for each reason. And actually, the most quoted, the most mentioned reasons to listen to podcasts were to learn something new. People want to learn something new, so they listen to their favorite podcast, or they also want to be entertained. Both reasons were mentioned by 50% of podcast users. The third most quoted reason was to relax, with 28%. And now, if we want to compare again podcasts with speech-based radio stations seems to be very important for people to catch up on news. That was the most mentioned reason. By half of the listeners mentioned to catch up on news as the main reason to listen to radio. Then comes to learn something new and for entertainment. So, of course, we can see there are some differences between podcasts and radio stations, speech-based radio stations, but there are also some similarities, of course. There are siblings media. And also we wanted to have a look at audiobooks. And actually, the main reasons to listen to audiobooks were to be entertained or to relax at 44% and 39%. And to learn something new, these reasons were the third most mentioned reason. I forgot to mention these are from the UK. You can see the small flag, but yeah. From the UK, from the Ofcom, that's the source. Still, in the UK, we wanted to understand a bit deeper why people were enjoying their podcast listening. And again, some comparison with radio. Here we have some statements, and we have the percentage of the among regular podcast listeners who slightly or strongly agree with each of these statements. And close to 8 in 10 regular podcast listeners in the UK think that they slightly or strongly agree with the fact that podcasts offer them something they can't get with radio. And around the same figure, close to 8 in 10 think that there is a lot more choice in what to listen to compared to radio. People like the range of content available on podcasts. 85% of regular podcast listeners slightly or strongly agreed with this statement. And they also find it quite easy to find podcasts they might enjoy. I insist on the fact that it's among regular podcast users, not the light users, but at least those who love really podcasts. They know how to find their podcasts for 3/4 of them at least. Moving to this next slide, if to click. Yeah, sorry. Okay, I spoiled you. That's fine. We wanted to know the popularity of podcasts over other media among podcast users. These are German data from Podstars OMR. And 7 in 10 users prefer listening to podcasts rather than reading about a topic. Of course, this could be linked to the content of podcasts. People maybe love the podcast experience, the podcast content. It could also be linked to the fact that it's quite convenient to listen to a podcast. You can multitask. It's easier to wash your dishes while listening to a podcast than reading about a topic, of course. And then for the second comparison, we compared the popularity of podcasts over rather than watching a video about a topic. And of course, it's among podcast users, but half of them prefer listening to podcasts rather than watching a video about a topic, which shows the power of podcast. Then, a bit unsurprisingly, I think, only 36% prefer listening to podcasts rather than listening to music. Of course, we know that music is a massive source of entertainment, so I still think that 36% is quite high, actually. So we just try to understand why people were actually listening to podcasts. But I also wanted to mention the reasons for not listening to online-only podcasts. So by online-only podcasts, we mean every type of podcast apart from catch-up radio. These are French data coming from CSA Research and Havas Paris. And it's among French non-listeners of online-only podcasts, which are the main reason for not listening to podcasts. And actually, a third of non-listeners don't know what podcasts are, or they don't know how to listen to them. So it's a question of awareness and knowledge. And of course, we can see some room for growth for podcast listening once the podcast will be completely commonplace across all demographics and people, etc. Then a second block of reasons was, I think, the low interest. So people answering either they don't have time or they don't think about podcasts. I think it's a question of low interest because I think that everyone got time to listen to a podcast at least once a week. And then the final one was about the competition with radio and the content discoverability. So people who prefer to listen to the radio, this can be due to the radio experience that they prefer over the podcast experience. It can also be about the content or about the medium. Some people find it easier to just turn on the radio button, while for other podcasts are more convenient because it's on demand, etc. And then some people don't find the content they like, so it's important also the discoverability is very important as well, especially for the light users. Then there is a final group, the people who actually used to listen to podcasts but who stopped. What were the main reasons for stop listening to podcasts? And the first group of answer were the question of content and discoverability, because 3 in 10 British person who listened to podcasts in the past but who stopped, 3 in 10 decided to stop because they could not find any podcast that interested them, or because they lost interest in the content of the podcast. We have a second group of answer, let's say, the question of the competition with other media and activities. So 29% decided to stop listening to podcasts because they do other activities more often, such as watching TV or gaming, etc. And 25% stopped because they don't have time. So it's again the question of low interest or competition with other activities and all kinds of activities, including silence. And then the other reasons were the question of format. So it's very important to keep that in mind when you're producing a podcast. Many people find podcasts that are usually too long. Of course, it depends on the type of podcast, but for some people, actually, it was one of the reasons they stopped. And then also for 13%, they found that podcast listening was actually inconvenient, which is quite surprising because sometimes people find it actually convenient to listen to podcasts, but for some people, it's not that easy, basically. Oof, sorry. I can go back. Perfect. So going to trying to answer the second question, how do people choose their podcast? Because I think that's a very important question. For many people, if for some people the wide catalog is great because they can find some niche content, podcasts, etc. That's great. But for many people, the wide catalog is sometimes difficult to navigate, especially among the light users. And 50% of German podcast listeners find the podcast offer confusing. Therefore, the podcast listeners need some assistance to find the podcast they like. And they also rely on key criteria to choose their podcast. Here we have Czech data from kindly shared by Czech Radio. What are the key criteria for choosing a podcast? Here we have the top 5. 64% of Czech podcast listeners, age 15 plus, said that the topic was definitely important. Then comes guests and performers. 39% saying that it's definitely important. Then comes personality of the host, sound quality or musical performance at 33%, 31%, and then the atmosphere of or the mood of the podcast. Now, how and where people tend to hear about new podcasts. These are UK data, and the first place or way people are hearing about new podcasts is word of mouth. Just with social media, both were mentioned by 32% of British people as a way to hear about new podcasts. Then comes the platforms from where they listen to podcasts, so for example, Spotify or BBC Sounds in the UK. And then we have cross-promotion, so podcasts were mentioned on a radio program, and so cross-promotion from radio to podcast, basically. Here we have same question, but in Germany, and the only difference here it's among podcast listeners, not among the total population, which explains a bit the differences in percentage. It's still interesting to see that the ranking is quite similar, actually. We have also word of mouth at the ranked very highly, with 67% of podcast listeners saying that they tend to hear about new podcasts from word of mouth, followed by recommendation from other podcasts. So this time from cross-promotion from podcast to podcast. Then, of course, social media and the app, the platforms. And for the next slides, I'm going to focus on 3 things. The first is the word of mouth, the second, social media and the platforms, just exploring a bit these areas. And basically, one of the reasons why word of mouth is so important is that people love to talk about what they listen to. 73% of French weekly podcast listeners talk about the online-only podcast they listen to with at least one relative. And they like to talk about all kind of content, all kind of podcasts, because online-only podcast listening has already allowed 71% of podcast listeners to raise taboo topics with relatives. So they can talk about any kind of content, and that's why word of mouth is so important. Then I also wanted to focus on social media, same source, also from CSA Research and Havas Paris from France. What are the most used social media to discover new podcasts? With a focus on social media, and 25% of French listeners of podcasts mention YouTube. So it's interesting to put it in social media, YouTube, but we can see that it's a massive platform, both for podcast discovery, but also for podcast listening, as the definition of podcast is a bit changing with the rise of watchable podcasts, etc. YouTube is followed by Facebook at 23%, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, former X, and Twitch and LinkedIn are at lower level, of course. And of course, there is a high correlation between the usage of this platform and the way of discovering podcasts on each of these platforms. These are general trends. It doesn't mean that you can't get massive traffic from Twitch for one podcast to another, but this just shows like some overall trends, an overall picture, I mean. Then the platforms, what are the most used one to listen to podcasts? Here we have the streaming services used to listen to podcasts in the last 12 months among Swedish internet users in 2022. Spotify is very big in Sweden, of course, with 29% of people saying that they listen to a podcast on Spotify in 2022. But we can see that broadcasters' own platform can also rank quite highly, because SR Play, the own platform of Swedish radio, the public service media, in Sweden ranked second with 11%. Then we have Apple Podcasts, Acast at 5%, and Google Podcasts at 1%. And we have same questions, but in the UK, most used audio services for podcast listening. And this this time among podcast listeners in 2023. Again, we see YouTube ranked very highly with 28%. Also, I forgot to mention that YouTube was not in the scope of the Swedish study. That's explained why it's not ranked. But yeah, YouTube is big also in the UK with 28% of answers, followed by Spotify at 27%. BBC Sounds ranked also very highly with 24%. Then we have at a slightly lower level Apple Podcast and Amazon Music. And then, sorry, okay, I will reveal everything. One way of discovering podcasts could have been also to identify the podcast producer, but actually, we have here Czech data from Czech Radio. Only a quarter of the listeners know the producer of most of the podcasts they listen to. So there is a question of brand awareness for the podcast production company or the broadcaster offering the podcast. So that's an issue, I would say. And even if for some people it's still clear who has produced the podcast or not. But even the importance of the creator when choosing a podcast is relatively low. It's mostly important for 15% of Czech podcast listeners. It's sometimes important or sometimes not important for 40%, and then it's not important at all for 40%. And talking about podcast producer, how do listeners identify podcast producers? Here we have this question was asked to German regular listeners of podcasts. How did they recognize the producer? 43% said that the producer was recognized from the logo or the description of the podcast, so something very visual. 40% recognized the producer thanks to a spot at the beginning or at the end of the podcast. And 45% it was because the moderator referred to the producer in the podcast. So actually, all three ways all have quite high percentages. So I think that anyway is a good way to increase the awareness of the podcast producer, basically. And I'm going to leave you with some key takeaways. So according to me, I think that podcast is booming. If that was the question in the previous presentation. It now reaches almost as many young Europeans, 44%, as radio, 46%. Podcast offers something you can't get with radio, according to close to 8 in 10 British regular podcast listeners. The catalog's breadth is valued by listeners, but it can interfere with discovery. Half of German listeners find the offer quite confusing because it's unlimited and yeah. To discover new podcasts, people mainly rely on word of mouth, but social media, audio streaming platforms, and cross-promotion are also crucial. And the most used platforms are Spotify and YouTube, but broadcasters can also widely reach their audience on their own platforms. And I just mentioned cross-promotion. That's just auto-promotion. If you want to follow the work of the market research team at the EBU, you can scan the QR code for the newsletter. Thank you. Thanks.
Matthieu, that was super interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Is there a bit of data or bit of information that you wanted to get but couldn't get?
That's a good question.
Because I feel like we as an industry are kind of like, we've got loads of data, but at the same time we haven't got any.
Yeah, it's very difficult to have also overall trends on the European market as a whole.
Yeah.
And then the question of the changing definition of podcast, it's also a struggle for us researcher because if the definition changes, then also the figures are not exactly comparable. But yeah.
Understood. Thank you so much. Thank you. Our next speaker is from the US. She's currently working at Descript, and we're going to talk about marketing. Arielle Nissenblatt.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. This is on? Yes. Okay. Here's the thing. How much time do I have?
20.
Okay. I am getting over an illness. So I'm just going to take a moment to open this water. I'm going to be very transparent with you. that I'm nervous, and that's okay. We're all here today to talk about podcasts and talk about radio, and I'm really excited to talk to you today about podcast marketing for creators. My name's Arielle. I'm going to talk about who I am, why I am, and what we can take away from this presentation today. We started off with a pep talk. That was great. I feel good about podcasts. Then we got into the data. And now we're going to talk about some practical usages of that data for you in this room today. So here's what we're going to talk about for the next 19.5 minutes. Who am I? Who are you? Very helpful for me to know who you are so that I am talking to a crowd and I can give you specific examples that will help you. I'm going to talk about the problem when it comes to podcast marketing. I'm going to talk about the solution and some ideas to implement. I want you to take away some things from our presentation today, and then I'm going to summarize everything and give you some action items. If you hear me wheezing, do not be alarmed. I am sick. Okay, who am I? That's me. That's a new headshot. My name's Arielle. I work at Descript, which, tell me if you're familiar with Descript. Okay, that's pretty good. Descript is a platform that helps you edit video and audio as if you are editing a text document. It's very cool. I am relatively new there because beforehand I worked at Squadcast, which is a remote recording platform. I was the marketing manager there and the head of content. And in August, we got acquired by Descript. So now I am working at Descript. In addition to working at Descript, I also have been working in the podcast space since 2017. I have a podcast recommendation newsletter that I send out every Sunday night, so it will be going out this Sunday night. You can get it by going to earbuds.audio. Must do a little bit of self-promotion, very important. And I love podcasts. That's why I work in the podcast space. I love listening to podcasts. I love helping people discover their next favorite podcast. I love helping creators make a show that's not shitty. And I love helping creators make a show that's not shitty reach people beyond just their friends and family. And that's what our conversation is about today. But who are you? This is a mirror so that you can look in the mirror and tell me who you are. So Sam did a little bit of this at the beginning. I know that we've got a lot of commercial broadcasters, a lot of public radio broadcasters, folks like that. Can you shout out the name of the company that you work for or a podcast that you work on? It's free self-promo time. Okay. Anyone? Thank you. Thank you. We're a little bit shyer than we are in the US, it seems. Thank you. I won't say it back to you, but I did hear you. Anyone else? Okay, interesting. Interesting that it happened the third time. Okay, good. That's who you are. I'm glad to know you, and I would love to talk with you more about what you're doing afterwards. But good to know who you are, what you're doing here. Let's talk about the problem. The reason I wanted to know who you were is because I think we've got a lot of creators in this room, and a lot of creators tend to find it difficult to do the marketing aspect. Raise your hand if that is something that resonates with you. Raise your hand if you also just do work in marketing. That's okay as well. Do you feel comfortable with marketing podcasts? I think it's like this issue, this large issue that we have. You know, there's rules when it comes to marketing radio. There's rules when it comes to marketing TV, rules when it comes to marketing film. Marketing podcasts is a little bit more elusive, and we're trying to define these things. So here is the problem, and I want to know how you're feeling once I tell you this problem. Marketing podcasts and audio is really tough, and I said /audio because I recognize we've got a lot of radio people here too. Creators don't have time to create and to market, and when we do market, it's not always very effective. So, for example, a lot of people spend a lot of time on social media. You know, after you have a new episode that goes out, you'll be like, new episode out now. And that does nothing, right? Like that's gonna reach like 3 people. The social media platforms don't love when you link out to another thing. So it's not gonna be a particularly effective thing for you to do. So what can you do that's actually effective? That's what we're gonna talk about today. That's where we're gonna spend the majority of our time. The solutions, and one thing that I must harp on, and I will harp on it multiple times, is that there are no shortcuts, and here I am wheezing, please excuse me. You can laugh. Okay. So solutions. 1, I want you to be aware of the greater landscape of the podcast/radio world. I'll get into some specifics. Number 2, I want you to get comfortable meeting listeners where they are right now. So meeting listeners where they are in 10 years is one thing. We all want more listeners in the podcast space. And Maria brought this up there. We are growing in terms of listenership year after year, but we also need to find the people who are listening now and who tend to listen to more than one podcast, who tend to listen to more than 6 podcasts. How do we find those people and make your podcast their next podcast listen? And number 3, we want to strategically be borrowing audiences from existing audiences, and I'll get into that. So let's get into the first one. We want to be aware of the greater podcast landscape. And I did hear a second ago from that corner, Podnews, And look, we got a mention on the board. How interesting is that? All right, so I want you to be aware of a bunch of different things in the podcast space. Okay, feel free to take a picture. Podnews, Podstars OMR. So a lot of my examples are going to be US-based, but I actually have, because I've been involved in the Radiodays circuit for a little bit, I've become aware of things outside of the US. How exciting is that, everybody? So we've got Podnews, we've got Podstars OMR, which is a really great newsletter that I subscribe to, and I just hit the translate button. It's in German. We've got Sounds Profitable, which is a great newsletter that goes out once a week, and we've got Edison Research. There's a lot of research organizations, but Edison is one that I tend to follow. And then let's move down to category number 2. This is the category that I call audience insights tools. So Rephonic is a really great tool. If you go to rephonic.com/graph and you search for any podcast, you can find a web of podcasts that podcast is connected to. I'll talk about why that's important a little bit later on. Listen Notes is what I like to call the Wikipedia of podcasting. They've got a lot of information. If your podcast is like this podcast, they list a bunch of other shows that are similar to it. You can also check out a podcast RSS feed on Listen Notes. So if you ever needed some information about where they're hosted or the email address that's associated with that podcast, you can find that using the RSS feed. Podengine.ai is a new one that I've come across. I recently did a demo with them, so I'm not going to say I fully endorse them, but I will say that it's worth checking them out. And Player.fm is interesting because what they do is it's mostly a listicle site, so you can search pretty much anything. You can search like podcasts for Americans in Germany, and there will probably be a list. Like you can be super specific if you go to player.fm. The other cool thing about player.fm is that it tells you how recently an episode was published. So you are not spending a ton of time doing research into a podcast that pod faded 15 years ago. So then there's also a bunch of other newsletters that I want you to subscribe to, and these are podcast recommendation newsletters. Podcast Delivery goes out every Monday and focuses on one new podcast every week. Find That Pod goes out every Friday. It's 5 podcasts. Podcast Rex, I just got a few moments ago. It's a really great newsletter. Podcast Review goes out on Fridays. Podcast The Newsletter goes out on Mondays. Podstack goes out on Thursdays. Here is from The Guardian, and 1.5 Speed is from Nick Qua at Vulture. So this is just some of them. There are tons of podcast newsletters. My hope for you is that you are aware of all of them. You are subscribed to most of them. I know it's a lot to ask of your inbox, but you don't have to read all of them every single week. I just think it's good to be aware of all the newsletters out there so that you know where your podcast or your organization's podcast fit in with these newsletters. Are you responding to the same things that they're responding to? Are you reaching out to people to collaborate? Are you generally speaking acknowledging the other things that are going on in this landscape? And then I also wanted to shout out number 4. There are a bunch of podcasts about podcasts. There's more than this. I just had this cute little deck over here, so I couldn't fit too many of them. So In and Around Podcasting is new from Mark Asquith. Check out this podcast, Your Next Podcast. There's so many more. Feel free to come up to me afterwards. I subscribe to everything. All I read, all I do, all I listen to is podcasts about podcasts. So feel free to ask me for anything. I want you to be aware of the greater podcast landscape. I also want you to meet podcast listeners where they are right now. And this is big because when we're trying to find ways to reach new audiences, one thing that we want to do, the thing that sounds easiest is to say, check it out, I have a new episode out now on social media, to friends, to family, to send out a newsletter, whatever it is. But that is not interesting at all. To just say I have a new episode out now is not really going to do anything for anyone except for you to check a box to say that you, quote unquote, did promotion. So in order to get in front of people who are ready to listen right now, you can advertise in podcast listening apps. You can pay money to be advertised in podcast listening apps. CastBox has a program. Pocket Cast has a program, Overcast has a program, Podbean has a program. A lot of different places have the ability for you to pay to be featured on those podcast listening apps, but you can also pitch yourself for editorial inclusion in those podcast listening apps. Apple and Spotify both have forms that you can fill out where you can say, here is why my show is so great that you would be a fool for not featuring it. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but it's worth pitching, and feel free to come up to me afterwards. I will give you the links. You can also meet podcast listeners where they're at right now by advertising in podcast newsletters or applying for general editorial inclusion in podcast newsletters. I just mentioned a moment ago all of the podcast newsletters, not all of them, like I said, there are so many, some of the podcast newsletters. A lot of those places need content. So I write a podcast recommendation newsletter, like I said, Earbuds Podcast Collective. The way it works is that each week is curated by a different person. Anyone can curate a list. The way it works is that each week is curated by a different person. Anyone can curate a list. That means I need you to curate lists for me. I have a form on my website where you can do that. A lot of the podcast listening apps have similar things going on. So either they have a form where you can fill out to be featured, or they want you to reply and say, hey, I really like this issue of the newsletter, and I would love it if you would consider my podcast. Yes, it's a podcast that is mostly for German speakers, but here's why I think it'll be relevant for your listeners in the US. You never know. The most important thing to do is to subscribe to these newsletters, read them, and pitch after knowing where your content fits into their content. And you want to meet podcast listeners while they are listening to other podcasts. And this actually was a statistic that came up in, I think it was the last presentation, that a lot of people discover podcasts while listening to other podcasts, especially in Germany. 46%, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, okay, good. So we want to get in front of those people who are listening to podcasts right now. And then also, of course, we can meet listeners where they're at right now in physical locations. So if you have a podcast about beer, why are you not advertising at a beer hall? Why is there not a QR code on the back of the bathroom to your podcast? Why are you not sponsoring the napkins at the beer hall with a QR code, right? Think about opportunities for you to meet potential listeners where they are. How much time do I have? Okay, cool. Let's talk about strategic borrowing of existing audiences. First, think about guesting opportunities. You want to be a guest on other people's podcasts that are similar to your podcast. I mentioned a few moments ago, Rephonic.com. Rephonic.com/graph is where you can go to type in the name of your podcast, type in the name of podcasts that are similar to yours, comps, if you will, comparison podcasts, and find out what podcasts are similar to those, both in name, in listeners, in keywords, in other things like that. And think about why you would make a great guest on some of these other podcasts. What is it about your content? What is it about the content of your organization that makes sense to also be highlighted on this other podcast? If you can get in front of these other existing audiences, you are borrowing from them and you are expanding the pie. We also want to borrow from existing audiences by setting up some non-monetary ad swaps. So the little bit that you hear before the show, in the middle of the show, or after the show that's like, hey, before we get to this week's episode of this podcast, we want to tell you about another podcast that we think you're going to love. And here's why you're going to love it specifically for you, this audience that I know so well. So it's not just your typical, we chat with people about all things that are super interesting and we really tell it like it is. That is not interesting. What is unique about your podcast that people are actually going to resonate with? That is going to make them go out of their way to type in the name of that podcast to their podcast player and actually listen to it and become a loyal listener beyond just listening to the first 30 seconds or to the trailer. So we want to think about getting in front of those audiences and then making sure that those ad swaps are not your typical, boring run-of-the-mill ad swaps. We really want to get interesting. We really want to say, let's think of an example actually. Okay, so I have a podcast called Feedback with Earbuds, which is a podcast recommendation podcast that goes along with my newsletter. And then my friend Lauren has a podcast called Feed the Queue, which goes along with her newsletter, which is also about podcast recommendations. Our assumption here is that people who listen to podcasts about podcasts would not mind listening to other podcasts about podcasts because then they can discover more podcasts. How exciting. So we set up a promo swap so that when I am at the beginning of my show, I can say, Hey, before we get to this week's episode of Feedback with Earbuds, I need to tell you, I don't want to, I need to tell you, and I would actually be as transparent as this. I would say, I need to tell you about Feed the Q. It's a podcast by my dear friend Lauren. She is obsessed with podcasts. All she does every single day is think about what to listen to. She listens on 1.8 speed. She has converted her husband to become a podcast listener. You better believe that the podcasts that she puts on her podcasts are going to be top of the line. They're going to be great recommendations for you. You're going to want to check out Feed the Q. And with that, we're going to get to my show. I hope you like my show enough that you're going to want to stick around, but Lauren will do the same thing for me. So theoretically, we'll trade some audiences there. So that wasn't like a, hey, before we get to this week's episode, let me tell you about Feed the Q. It was, here are some reasons why Lauren is so fascinating and so interested in podcasts that you would be a fool not to listen to Feed the Q. So think about going above and beyond and think about being transparent with your listeners about why you want them to convert to becoming listeners of this other podcast as well. Feed swaps are a little bit similar. We're putting an entire episode of my podcast into Feed the Q's feed, and we're putting an entire episode of Feed the Q into my feed, and we're explaining to our listeners why we're doing that, and we're making sure that it's a really great match, because otherwise they might not be interested. They might say, you know, I feel like I'm kind of being shucked around. I feel like, why is the podcast that I'm tuning into taking me to another podcast? So we really want to make sure that that is the right match and that we are explaining to our listeners why that's the right match. I heard a really great example of this recently on a show called Search Engine. It's a new show from PJ Vogt, who used to host Reply All, which was a very popular show in the US for many years. And what he did actually before he dropped an episode of somebody else's podcast was he said, I am actually pissed because I wanted to do this episode first, but then Radio Atlantic got to it first. So we decided that we just had to play this episode on our feed. That is a perfect example of a feed swap, or an introduction to a feed swap, because it shows me that there is a reason you are playing this episode for me right now. If you weren't playing it for me right now, you would probably make that episode 6 months down the line. So here we are, we get it as a treat right now. So think about very interesting ways to let your audience into this new piece of content. And then, of course, you can create content integrations that are made for both feeds. So say you find a show that it really is a perfect match. Think about maybe if you interview each other. Think about maybe if you decide to create an episode together and place it on both of your feeds with a new introduction. Like I said, there are no shortcuts. A lot of what I said takes a long time. Like, these are not hacks. These are not like your marketing guru, like, here are the top 10 ways to do X, Y, and Z in the shortest amount of time. None of this is going to take a short amount of time. It is all going to take some time, and that's okay. Because ultimately what we're doing is we are building alliances with audiences of similar podcasts. And we want listeners who are going to stick around for a long time, not listeners who are going to be there and listen to one episode and then go away. We want them to like your content so much when they hear about it on somebody else's podcast that they become a loyal listener to your show. And then you can do consistent promo swaps, feed swaps with that new collaborative partner. And like I said, I'm really harping on it. So there really are no shortcuts. Sorry. Here are some action items, I promised. At this event, here's what you can do. You can find partners. There are a lot of people in this room. It's very encouraging. It's really good for the podcast space. It's really good for the radio space. It's really good for audio. I love audio. You can find partners, podcast/radio programs that are similar to yours. So when you go outside, when you start schmoozing later, you can raise your hand and you can say, I have a podcast about, I don't know, sports, and I have a, oops, what did I do? I have a podcast about sports, and maybe I have a podcast about mindset and mentality when it comes to sports. Maybe those two podcasts can collaborate in some way. You can identify the crossover areas, and then you can negotiate these matches. And what I mean by negotiate is maybe your show is a lot bigger than the other show that you want to collaborate with, but I still encourage you to see that as a potential collaborator, because they probably still do have audience that is worth borrowing from. You just need to figure out what's going to make it an equal split. So maybe you do one ad read for their two. Maybe you do a shorter ad read for their longer ad read. You can have those discussions. And then here are some questions to ask your potential swap partners. One, what kind of inventory does your show/network have? You know, for example, do you have guests? Can I be a guest? Can I pitch somebody else to be a guest? How many downloads are you comfortable swapping for? Like I said, maybe I get 10,000 downloads per episode and you get 2,000 downloads per episode. We're gonna have to do some math to make sure that it's equal. Number 3, what kind of bandwidth does the production team have? Should we set up a promo swap, a guest swap, a feed swap, or a joint creative episode? And the reason for that is because if you're a one-person team, you probably don't have so much time to deviate from your regularly scheduled season. So maybe a guest swap makes sense, maybe a promo swap makes sense, but maybe a creative integration isn't really on the table right now. And also, how do you assess the success of a collaboration? That is more up to you to figure out with your partner, but I wanted to put all those questions out there for you. And that's a wrap. This is all my contact information. I would love to stay in touch. I love podcasts. I hope that you subscribe to my newsletter, and I hope that you find a lot of partners to potentially collaborate with. Thank you.
Don't go. Stay. And Maria and Matthieu, do you want to join as well? So we're going to now chat for 20 minutes or so. So you and I have talked a couple of times about all of that stuff that you've just kind of run through there. Is that changing at the moment, that stuff, or is that settled? Is that the kind of...
These are tactics that I constantly recommend no matter what, but they are different based on what stage you're at and how big your show is. So, the funny thing about giving blanket advice, of course, is that it's blanket advice. You're gonna have to take all of this and think what do I have the bandwidth for? What can I actually do? Yeah. And you have to decide, maybe I did a promo swap and it didn't work. Are you gonna give up? Are you gonna say Arielle's an idiot? Or are you gonna say, maybe I was wrong and maybe I need to redo this and maybe my copy wasn't strong enough, right? So a lot of different factors.
Yeah. So we're now gonna talk for 20 minutes or so and answer your questions if you have them. So we've got Remi with a microphone. Does anyone want to kick us off? Does anyone got a burning question from having sat and watched these? No? Okay, all right, well, I'll start. Hey, one of the things that you mentioned, Maria, which got my mind racing, and I feel like I've kind of had these types of conversations at the BBC quite a lot, is the Michelle Obama podcast.
Yeah.
Right? Why was the Michelle Obama podcast so rubbish? In your view, because you've got massive talent, you've got a big story, you've got quite a unique selling point, but it didn't work.
I think it was lazy. There's no TV station, there's no radio station who would just be just sit down, here's a microphone, just do stuff. Yeah. They would sit down beforehand and talk about what interests you, where's the interest in the audience, and how should we put that together? Have a structure maybe in the episode, and have some really interesting things that are happening. But I listened to people having a conversation that they even seemed bored about. I'm just talking about the first episode with her husband, and
her husband,
and it was her podcast, and I was really excited about it because on the one hand, it was for me a turning point was President Obama in the garage with Mark Maron.
Yeah.
I have that picture in my first studio on the wall because I thought
that was an iconic moment.
Yeah, because and back then I had another job still, and I thought, okay, that's it. Presidents on podcast now. It's happening. It's starting. So I printed it out and put it on my wall and went podcasting full time. That was the thing for me. And so at some point I was very excited about having these two people, or having her especially, in the podcasting space, and then it was so disappointing. I was so sad. And I just felt it was just lazy. It felt lazy. I don't know what happened behind the scenes. Maybe she was I don't want to.
I'm pretty sure it was mostly a repurposing of her live talks around her book.
Yeah.
So that's why I think it came off lazy.
Okay.
I won't say anything more negative because she rules.
But
yeah, she does. But that made the disappointment bigger because I love her books.
She rules.
And I love everything and I still love it. But I felt that was a kind of it was a bit disappointing for the podcast space. And this is what I said, because the talk about her books and everything else was taken very seriously, but I thought the podcast itself wasn't taken very seriously. And that what made me a bit sad,
Did anyone in the room make this podcast, by the way? No, okay. And I only mention it because I just thought it was quite kind of symbolic of one of the things which I think you were kind of alluding to throughout your piece, which was like, we are a kind of special, bespoke, niche, cute little thing, but we've grown to the point where actually now we're kind of like, we've got the big beasts around us, we're kind of like big broadcasters, big talent, big marketing, big promotion. But actually, in order to kind of stay special, we need to kind of remember almost what it is that makes us special.
Yeah, absolutely. And we not be like every episode has to be 45 minutes because some other market that works. It's the freedom that we enjoyed in the beginning, that we could be as long or as short, and every episode could be different and stuff like that. And we should remember that freedom and be still like, let the content be boss and not the like, how do other media work with it? And this is the unique stuff. We have to like remember it and then
take advantage of that.
Yeah.
Does anyone have a question? There was an arm up.
I'm at the end of
First
my
one up there,
English.
Remi. Yeah, I totally agree. And I feel like it's, as I say, it's a conversation that happens at the BBC a lot. Would you like to introduce yourself and ask your question? Say where you're from as well, please.
Hello, my name is Arielle and I work in the Norwegian Broadcasting Company. And I have a question about Michelle Obama's podcast not being a success because it was lazy or not prepared enough. Is that correct?
I want to put on. It felt lazy. I don't know what happened in the background. I don't know, because I'm very sure that there were people working hard on it, but it felt lazy for me as a listener.
Poor old Michelle. I think we should.
Yeah. So I don't, because everything else she does is great. So it felt a bit like, but of course I cannot say what happened behind the scenes.
And then I get to my question. Okay.
Yeah.
Joe Rogan show.
Yeah.
Is tremendously popular.
Yes.
And seems to me to be rather lazily performed and not researched properly. To me, it seems like they are just talking for several hours, going nowhere and having no plan. And yet that podcast is extremely popular.
Yeah.
Do you have any comments or thoughts on that?
Yeah, me? Should I? I think, first of all, it wouldn't be as popular if he would start today. Because he started when there were it felt like there were 40 podcasts. And he's also very consistent and stuff like that. And he, for me, is a totally different genre than the Michelle Obama podcast, because he came out at a time where it was mostly a talking podcast. In German, we say Laber podcast, just people talking without and I think he does a lot of research. I just think at the wrong places, but that's just me.
He is also appealing to disaffected youth in America. And that, I don't know. Look, I can't stand that guy. I have very publicly tweeted about how much I just don't like that he is a lot of people's first podcast. When people think of podcasts, they think of Joe Rogan. It's very unfortunate. So we need to hear, and in our day jobs, constantly be resetting that and giving people other examples and giving people other recommendations.
But I guess there's a lot to be learned from that podcast.
Absolutely.
I mean,
he utilizes video really well. In that he literally just utilizes video and his clips go viral. He's an example of what a lot of people think clips can do. So that's definitely something to take note of. But I think he's really popular because he doesn't do research. And when he doesn't do research, he can say whatever he wants. Okay, we should go to somebody who's going to say something more practical.
Yeah.
No, I'm completely 100% with her.
Let's move on. Claire.
Hi, my name's Claire McGinn from the BBC, and this actually picks up on this. What are your views about visualization? Because we saw in one of Matthieu's slides about the importance of YouTube, and we're seeing more and more YouTube being used either to have these small clips that cannibalize the kind of... It actually means that people don't listen to the whole thing. They just pick out the best bits, and that's what they do. But when you talk about barriers to entry, it feels now there's pressure on people to visualize everything, which means cameras and lighting. And the thing that you talked about, which was the easiness, how accessible it was. That seems to be changing. So I'm just curious to hear what you think about it.
I think that the visualization thing was obvious on the YouTube videos, but also the fact that social media are so important to make people discover new podcasts, and social media is also a lot about videos and visual aspects. So I think it's even beyond YouTube and YouTube Shorts. It's broader than that, I think. And even the definition of podcast is changing quite a lot. And the fact that now video podcasts are, and especially among some demographics, the youngest ones, quite commonplace. And many people talk about some video of interviews as a podcast. Makes it more and more intervene between YouTube, between videos and podcasts. Yeah. So yeah.
Do you think it's a threat, though?
No, not at all. Because one main thing people love about podcasts is that they just can take it with them wherever they go, and that you can do that with video. I think it's important to talk about it, but also you have to know that not every podcast on YouTube has video. Some of them have just a cover or something, and people just listen to it because they are on YouTube already. And also you have to, I think it's being talked about a lot, not as much as AI right now. I think it's, but I still think audio podcasts will stay the most like the thing that will get most, because a lot of our clients, like every client we had, came to us. So should we make video podcasts now? And then we told them how much money they would have to spend. They were like, oh yeah, audio's fine. And I think it is important to think about how can I use it for social media, but preparing something to use it on social media is completely different than recording a whole episode and just put it out there. So I think these are two different things. And also, this is just one thing I want to talk about, or I want to say, because I think about it a lot. I kind of don't like it too much to have it like be something you have to do, because it is a bit, maybe even a bit anti-feminist, because the cool thing about audio was it is a safe space. You don't have to show your face. You don't have to, like, the people who get judged, and it still is like that, if they don't put their hair or don't have makeup on or whatever, or don't look like other people want them to look, did find a very, very cool safe space in podcasts. And just because you don't know what I look like, but you still listen to me because I am an expert on what I'm saying. And now if we put video back at it again, I don't like that too much, but of course we have to talk about it.
Can I just add something?
You go for it.
I think it's worth it to be experimenting with clips, at least to start, on a 3-month cycle. So if you're a production company or production house, you've been hearing, we gotta experiment with video. Experiment with video, do it for 3 months. Try clips, try audiograms. There are easy ways to do it that automate the process to a certain extent. If none of those clips take off, you can tell your shareholders that we tried, and try it again in a few months from now when there's a little bit more data with YouTube, and especially with YouTube podcasts, with YouTube potentially ingesting RSS feeds in the future, they say. So I don't know, I think it's worth it to experiment. It's worth it to experiment with clips. If you are already recording video, which you may be if you're recording with Squadcast or Riverside, then it's worth it to maybe have like a moment at the end of the conversation where you say to your guest, now let's look at the camera and create a clip specifically for video. But just start with that.
What do people either in the room or on stage think about this idea of cannibalization that Claire's kind of referring to? So, like, by having a successful video strategy online, are you cannibalizing your either audio or your RSS audience? I know RSS is now mixed with YouTube, but
I think that video is often also an entry point to a podcast, so people discover a new podcast thanks to video. But then people love the audio versions of those podcasts, which are also watchable. And I think that audio, even for these watchable podcasts, I had research from Czech Republic which shows that actually more people preferred the audio version than the video version, so I think that's quite reassuring.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Niels from the Netherlands. I have 2 questions about the numbers Matthieu presented about people who had stopped listening to podcasts. First of all, I was really surprised that a third couldn't find anything they liked, but they had listened to podcasts. So do you know how many times they had listened? Are they all light listeners?
No, they just responded saying, I used to listen to podcasts. We don't know if they were regular. There are probably light users of podcasts, I guess. Yeah. And I think that, the main issue is because it's difficult to say that you can't find any podcast that suits you because you have such a huge catalog.
Exactly. It's just being difficult.
So it's just difficult, yeah. Just,
and then 20% stopped listening because they thought their podcast was too long. Yeah. And apparently they also have the previous problem because otherwise they would have found another podcast, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Pretty weird.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, there are some short ones.
Was that a write-in answer, or those were the options given to them?
I think it was, you had a selection of potential answers to select.
Because I always wonder when gathering statistics, how much is just like, I got to fill out a box, so I might as well give this answer. I don't know.
When comparing the different percentages, you didn't have strong differences it was like between the top answers were at 30% and this one was at 21%. So it was still quite high compared to others. But of course, the question of format, it has to be adapted to each genre, to each podcast. So if you can have a Taylor Swift interview at your podcast, you should not have a short one, I think. So of course, it depends on the genre. For some genre, people prefer to be immersed and they prefer longer podcasts, for example, for interviews or true crime, for example. But then for the news updates, even if you can have some deep dive into some news topics, of course, people like also to have short versions, so short updates, just like on the radio. So it depends on the genre as well, a lot.
My sense is in the UK at the moment that the market, to me, feels quite split, where you've got this kind of in the top 50 podcasts in the UK, you've got this kind of group of pods, which is like, get in, give me the information, make me feel clever, all of that stuff. And then you've got the other 50% is just like 2 hours of kind of like waffling, kind of interesting, engaging, but like, not too short. Brett.
Just want to say we've got a whole session on visualization of podcasts tomorrow at 4:00. If people want to come, and we'll be giving you sort of do's and don'ts and takeaways on some of the podcasts we've been working on. But in answer to the question, it's notable that some of the biggest podcasts in the UK, the news agents, Rest is Politics, Kamehameha Film Review, only do clips. They don't visualize the full show because if you're giving it away in a visual version on YouTube, it's harder to then monetize the audio. So those shows that are doing really well in terms of audio are not doing full-length video. And if the person you're working with already has a big YouTube following or a big TikTok following, and that's where you're putting your podcast, that's where people are going to listen to it. You're not going to be able to convert it into a really successful audio podcast. Anyway, more tomorrow.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, I just also wanted to comment on the video strategy as well.
Do you want to just introduce yourself again, Norma?
Yeah, I'm Norma Jean. I'm the head of events, and then I do enterprise private podcasting for Podbean. We're a podcast software company. I'm going to speak a little bit later today, but Edison actually came out with a statistic in 2022, I think, that YouTube is the #1 digital discovery platform for podcasting. So apart from word of mouth, YouTube's top. So I think what Matthieu said in terms of discoverability, because it is a bit of an issue, and some of the directories, which would be like an app that you listen to podcasts on, have a bit of a walled garden approach. So if you're looking for new podcasts, you're going to see things that they're specifically pushing to you. And if it's not something of interest, it can be an issue. But the use case for audio listenership is different than video. I mean, I think, Maria, you were talking about this, but like when you're doing the dishes or when you're going for a walk, and especially post-COVID, I think in terms of the screen time and the way that people interact with screens is much different. And so podcasting is quite mindful in the way that people are not on a screen visually. So it's a secondary medium that's not capturing both of those senses at the same time.
Great. We've probably got time for one more question. Does anyone have a final question to end on? Thank you. And then we have one more short presentation. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, of course. Hi, my name is Vladimir, and I'm coming from podcast.rs, which is a Serbian platform for kind of gathering the local podcasters from the region. We also have a production house. Now, I just wanted to kind of also comment on the kind of a main topic that came out here, which is the video. This has to be looked at in a different way. I mean, it's the one thing is in the UK and the States where you have a very kind of a developed audio culture or radio listening culture. But for example, for us in a kind of a smaller countries where podcasting is a rather new medium, so it's only been around for a couple of years, if you don't have a YouTube video, you're basically not making it. So the most popular podcasters in Serbia are the ones who are doing the full YouTube video thing. And they can reach wide audiences, they can get like sponsorship money, sponsorship deals, and so on. If you're not doing that, if you're only on audio, you're not going to reach anybody, basically. There are ways, I mean, now we are advocating as well with the stuff that we do, which is a bit more narrative and so on, to kind of create some visuals or audiograms or whatever, but you have to be on YouTube. Otherwise, you're not reaching people. But this is not the case just in Serbia. I've seen also on Podnews some information about Latvia, Estonia, and so on, that the YouTube is still #1 platform. And this is, I guess, because most of the people in these countries are considering YouTube as a kind of a free media place where they are already. YouTube has been in Serbia 10 years, or I don't know, at least like 5-6 years before we got Spotify. So I guess these are also some of the I mean.
Yeah, very interesting.
Can I add something about, somebody asked before about cannibalization, and if you are sending potential audience to YouTube, you're not sending them to your podcast. Are you monetizing on YouTube? Are you monetizing on your podcast? I think to throw in another thing, are you also potentially sending them to your newsletter? Are you also potentially sending them to your social media? I think a lot of people worry about this. They worry about fragmenting their audience. But I think the big thing is to choose one place where you want to be your hub. And then look, if the other ones grow, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If your goal is to have people consume your content, I don't think, unless you have a deal with YouTube or a deal with Spotify, that it necessarily matters where they're consuming that content, just that they are consuming that content. And that I still do think that you should be capturing email addresses so that you can be in touch with your audience when you want to be in touch with your audience, as opposed to like if a server goes down and your podcast is not available. But I think I almost would dispel the idea of cannibalization of content on different places.
Great. Guys, thank you so much. Matthieu, Maria, Arielle, thank you. Please put your hands together. Great. So we've got one final presentation from the sponsors of today's podcast summit. So just before we break for 15 minutes, our final speakers, Anna Ribera and Alexander Damiano. Thank you. I don't know if you want these or that. It's up to you. It's up to you.
Okay, thank you. This is going to be quick, so we will go for lunch. Okay. So, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Do you know what is the most listened to podcast in Germany? Do you know who is the most important daily in Spain? Do you know who is the most famous host in Italy? Who is the leading French producer company? If I like the game, I would say that less than 20 people in this room can answer to all of those questions, although mostly all of us can answer those questions regarding to the US market. Am I wrong? My name is Ana Ribera, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Prisa Audio, the leading Spanish language podcast. And among other things, because I also write a newsletter for El País with podcast recommendations, I'm the coordinator of the WePod project. So I should tell you also that I'm passionate about podcasts. I'm almost a geek. For almost 10 years, I have been keeping a diary of all that I have been listening to. The result, a spreadsheet with more than 700 entries with all the podcasts that I have been listening, with all the data you can imagine. Name of the podcast, of the host, of the producer company, name of number of episodes, length, topic, category, ratings, my commentaries, you name it. Although I'm really proud of being such an organized person, I have to tell you that until really recently, I was a little bit ashamed of how little content in that spreadsheet came from the European market, because most of us came from, of course, from the Spanish market, the Spanish language market, and the US market. But this changed completely 2 years ago, which brings me to WePod. In 2022, at Prisa Audio, we identified a business opportunity by applying to a call from the European Commission under its Europe Creative Program for collaborative journalism. So what we do, we start knocking on doors in different countries of Europe, pulling contacts, and that's how I met Alexander from Europod and the people from the University Roma Tre from Italy. So we create a team, and we worked through several months to come up with an idea, well, a rather simple idea, which is called a collaborative project called WePod. So you tell us later, after this 10 minutes, if this is a simple idea or we just get ourselves into a nightmare. Alex?
Yeah, so this is typically Anna Ribera leaving the hard work to me to explain you how a European project works. I will never, where's my colleague Andrea? I mean, she put me on there. I'm pretty embarrassed by that. Yeah, I will never forgive you for that. But my name is Alex. I'm the COO of Europod. And when we developed WePod, we had this idea in mind to develop a project in the context of Creative Europe for journalistic partnership, but focused on podcasting. And we had the idea to base it on 4 pillars. And the first one was to run a project to experiment co-productions between different podcast companies in different European countries, and the result of this being podcast series in different languages. Same topic, different language, same story, different language. And to do also remakes of these co-productions into English language to reach an international audience. Then we thought it would be really cool if we had an infrastructure which would allow stakeholders from different European countries to trade intellectual property, so that it's easier for a podcast company in Spain, for instance, to acquire the rights of a podcast which was produced, for instance, in Sweden or another European country. Then we thought we have to share all this knowledge to go beyond the people in the project and share it with whom? With podcast professionals from the industry, of course, but also with the podcasters of the future. So with students, for instance, enrolled in media studies. And therefore, this leads me to the involvement of the University of Rome 3. We are going to write academic publications and books about how to do co-productions at the European level, and we will publish production dossiers. Not only we plan to run workshops in 6 different countries and organize the first European Podcast Academy in Milan in 2025, targeting 50 podcasters from different European countries. Last but not least, it's the 4th pillar. We would like to create the first European association of podcast and audio companies in Europe, because we believe it's fundamental that we start to lobby European institutions and national institutions to invest more into this sector, as they do nowadays, for instance, for movie, cinema, etc. So with this simple idea, we went and knocked the doors of different companies in Europe. And luckily enough, someone jumped on this crazy ride. And today we are 9 companies inside WePod, coming from 7 countries, from Belgium, France, Italy, Spain, Poland, Hungary, and Serbia. So we are also outside of the European Union, technically speaking. Back to you guys, right?
Okay. So now that's all good and nice, but I must confess that the challenge can be sometimes scary, because how do you find a topic equally engaging for Italy, Hungary, Belgium, and Spain? How do you work with journalists and producers with different experience and backgrounds? And what about language? Are we going to be able to work all together in English and from that create different adaptations for the national audience? And how we are going to incorporate the process of university research in this whole idea? And of course, how we are going to communicate all that we are trying to achieve until August 2025 to all the audiences, not only you, but also listeners. If I'm totally honest with you, we don't have the answers to all of those questions, but work to have them make perfect sense if we want to develop the podcast market in Europe. But there's one thing that I can tell you right now, when we are almost 7 months into the project, is that the journey has been completely amazing. Hasn't it?
Yeah, it's obviously always fascinating to solve the problems of an entire industry with a European project. But I wanted also to give you a bit more of a concrete idea of what these co-productions could look like and are looking like inside WePod right now. So the first product we are going to release in less than 2 months from now will be called AI in You. And it's a co-production between Europod, between Podium Podcast, which is the podcast branch of Prisa Audio. There's also the powerhouse Cora Media from Italy inside, and we are partnering also with Agence France Presse on this one. So why is this special as a project? Because this is being a co-production, we are producing the same podcast series in 6 languages and releasing it on 4 national markets in terms of promotion. These national markets are linked to the partners of the co-production, of course. And how did we go about this? Basically, we gathered 6 hosts from 6 different countries, so native in their own language. And these hosts are influencers, journalists, or either also artists who have dealt with artificial intelligence in their career. And they have adapted an original script in English language to the national versions. And then we had the editors of the 4 companies reviewing the scripts. After the production, the promotion will be done on the national markets by the media companies who are part of the co-production, and the whole thing is distributed by Europod in this specific case. We are not only eager to test content production and co-production, but we are also eager to test how to develop business models related to these productions, which is obviously really important. In this case, our plan is, for instance, to look for a sponsor. And why would a sponsor be specifically interested in such a project? Is because through this kind of co-productions, you have an impact on 4 different markets, so not only one language. So you reach a wider audience, and potentially you can associate yourself with top quality online media like Prisa Audio, Cora Media, Agence France Presse, etc., etc. We will have also other co-productions, will be more narrative and reportage style, but I really wanted to show you this. That said, we are not here to brag about WePod. Obviously, honestly, we're really proud of this project, and the time we're spending on it is huge right now until September 2025. But the ultimate reason why we're here on this stage is because we will launch a message to you, is that you remember the 4th pillar, the European Association? Well, if you believe that that mission to lobby national European institutions to invest more into podcasting is something that resonates with your company's mission, or if you're an individual podcaster, if you're interested in that, we'd love you to just take hold of us, at the networking sessions outside here, and we can have a chat about, how we plan to do things, how this will happening over the next months. And with that, back to you, Anna, for the closure.
Okay, so this WePod, in a very quick way to tell you, WePod is more than a project. It's a vision of what European collaboration can and must achieve in the field of digital media and journalism. Through working together right now, we are not only creating content that transcends borders, we are creating a community of European professionals who believe that working together for the profitability and the sustainability of the podcast is crucial for the media. So thank you very much for listening to us, and hope you join us.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys, and thanks to everyone. We're going to break for 15 minutes. There is a coffee shop over there, and you can grab some food, and we will start bang on at 2 o'clock. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks, guys. That was great.